grab those learning materials from the chat and make a copy of that to your own Google Drive so that you do have the editing access. The other thing you'll see on the screen now is a map of the world. I know you all are collecting a participant map throughout the course of the summit, but I'd also love to see where we have folks calling in from today. And this software, PolEv, is something we're going to be using out throughout the course of today's session. So I welcome you to go to polev.com/FBL524. And Sherry's, thank you for dropping that in the chat as well. You can click on the link directly from the chat to get to this poll everywhere, to go ahead and drop a little icon on the map. Let's see where everyone's coming in from. And then you can stay on this link for all of the other polling that we will be doing today. As I mentioned, we are going to be also using breakout rooms. So just a note that I'd love, if you do get disconnected in the breakout rooms for any reason, just come back to that main session and we'll go ahead and reconnect you. I know there's a lot of moving parts happening today, but want to make sure folks have the chance to connect with each other. And finally, since there are so many of us on the call today, we do ask that you use the chat function, that you use this poll everywhere in order for everyone to be heard. And thank you, Blair, for also dropping in the chat all of the tags. You can follow along with us online on Twitter as well. So taking a look at the map, really excited to see where we've got people calling in from. Looks like a lot of our friends on the other side of the world have gone to bed already, understandable, but we've got a lot of folks from across the US, Latin and South America here dialing in. So thank you all so much for being a part of the session today. I've heard that they've all been going really well. Nice to meet you, Alonzo. Thanks for dropping yourself in the chat as well. And one of the things that I was told is that these 45 minutes go by really quickly. So I am going to go ahead and dive right in. Please feel free to keep introducing yourselves in the chat. Continue to show us where in the world you're joining from. We're going to capture all of this information on PolEv after the session today. But we're all here because we heard that feedback and listening is something we'd be talking about today, getting buy-in, understanding who in our organization, who in our community really does need to be listening. So I want to jump right into that and kind of skip all of the background on who we are as an organization. I'll share that information with you all afterwards, but this concept of listening and feedback is something that everyone on the call today believes in. And I know you do because I know where you're calling from. I know the work that you do, and I'm really excited that that is something that is meaningful and important. But we often do use this language interchangeably, listening and feedback. We also kind of all have some different definitions of what does it really mean to be acting on feedback. And so to start today, I'm just going to orient us all around some shared definitions that we use at Feedback Labs. Acknowledge that we are going to use some of this language interchangeably, but hopefully we can all get on the same page as we dive into those workshop materials that you all have access to in the chat. So when we're talking about feedback, we're really talking about a helpful tool for effective listening. And listening is about having a conversation, not simply extracting information. It's a mutual process of asking and adapting based on what you hear. And so the reason that we're talking about this is because we really want to prioritize the thoughts and feelings and perceptions from the people who are affected by the products or services that we are providing, and make that be the center of our decision making, to really listen and adapt on what we're hearing to drive our decision making. And we also say perceptions from the people that are affected by the product or services that we're offering, because feedback at its core is really about what we can learn only from people themselves and the impact that that those activities are having on their lives. It's not something that we can observe externally, that we can say, oh, it looks like they're being affected in this way. The feedback on the perceptions of thoughts and feelings, we can only learn from our constituents themselves. And then to truly have an effective feedback practice, we want to have a closed feedback loop. And so the feedback loop methodology that we talk about here at Feedback Labs, really is about that process of collecting perceptual data, that what we heard, what our constituents perceive about the program that is affecting their lives. And then the loop piece of it is making changes to our activities based on what we've heard. And in our methodology, there are 6 stages to the feedback loop. We start on this outside stage, and what we're going to really be diving in today is the buy-in. And you'll see that it circles the entire loop because it is not just the first thing that we do. It has to happen continuously throughout a feedback loop, throughout the process. And so I'm hoping that by the end of today, you'll really feel equipped with what it means to be getting buy-in and how to be doing it, in order to apply that throughout all of the other stages of a feedback process at your own organizations. And what are the rest of those stages of the loop? So we talk about designing the process, really understanding what is happening in our constituents' lives, in the communities where we work, so we can design the best feedback process. Then once we've designed it, we can actually collect that data and be learning from our constituents about their thoughts, their feelings, their perceptions on what's affecting their lives. Then we move on to analyze that data. But before we can really do anything with that data we've analyzed, we talk about dialogue. And that means bringing that data back to the community that we collected feedback from and talking about it, saying, hey, we think we heard you say this. Did we get that right? Let's make sure we're understanding this fully before we can make any changes. And then we course correct. Then we make those changes based on what we've heard. And it's a loop. So simply collecting that feedback is not enough. Just doing this loop one time is not enough. It's a continuous process. And ideally, this full process is going to be in partnership with your community. And then we can use this information that we've learned to influence decision makers to be able to make those desired changes. And why does this matter? And this is something that I think everyone on the line really can get behind, because we all are, familiar with wanting to make the most impact possible. And we're also familiar with the trials and tribulations that often affect international nonprofits in how do we make time for this? How do we make sure we have the resources for it? And feedback and listening really can overcome a lot of those barriers that we often see. It can help us identify the most effective solutions for our affected communities, but it can also save valuable time and money by listening first before deciding what we're going to do, what we're going to act on. And finally, and most importantly, it helps us identify the needs of our community members who aren't being met, who are often overheard, and being able to emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion in our efforts, in our programs, in our services. So you might be asking, if this is all so great, why isn't everyone already doing it? Why do we need a workshop on it today at the end of a long day? And the problem is that they are great, but there are so many myths about feedback. There's so often do I hear, well, I love listening. I know it's important, but I won't be able to do it. Or I won't be able to convince someone else to do it. I won't be able to prioritize this in my organization. And the 3 myths we often hear is the fear that I won't be able to respond to it, that I'll hear information, I'll hear feedback that I can't make changes on, and therefore I just shouldn't ask in the first place. Or, well, I know I don't have the time or resources. COVID-19's really hit us hard. We don't have extra cash. Or I know I can't ask more of a burden on my staff right now. And we hear that, and it's so important to recognize how paralyzing some stressful times can feel like. But again, as we said on the last slide, it actually can save valuable time and money in the long run. And finally, we often hear, well, no one other than me thinks this is important, and I can't do this alone. And that's the one that I really want us to focus in on today, is getting that buy-in and identifying the stakeholders that are going to help us integrate this into our work and into our lives across the board. So now is the moment that I'm going to ask that you turn to your workbook, and we're going to start just by identifying a very brief feedback challenge that you're facing in your work. Now that we all kind of have the same shared concept of what is feedback, how we might be using it, I'm going to ask that you turn to page 4 in your learning materials, and we'll go ahead and drop those learning materials in the chat again, just to make sure everyone has access to them, that you can start working with them on your own as well, that you've got your own copied independent document that you can edit. And if you turn to page 4, you'll see these questions around a feedback challenge. So the first question that I'm going to ask you all to take 2 minutes to reflect on these 3 questions, and then we're going to share out to the group. And you're going to share it in an anonymous way, so don't worry, but I am going to ask that we use that poll EV function again to hear what some of the challenges we're facing today in our work. So as you think about your feedback challenge, I'm asking, what have you faced in the past or in your work currently where you might want to be listening better? You might want to be listening at all. You might know that you want to talk to your constituents, but you're not sure how. You might not know who else needs to help you make this happen. What challenges do you face when you think about feedback in your organization, in your work? What prevents you from collecting it? What prevents you from acting on it? And then who is involved in this challenge? Who else in your organization, in your community, is a part of this challenge? And what would you like to see change? So I'm going to go ahead and give you all another 30 seconds to reflect on this in your workbook, again on page 4. And then I'm going to open the next poll EV here. So on that same link at pollev.com/FBL524, you have the opportunity to type in a brief reflection on what your feedback challenge is. And we're going to go ahead and let this be open for a few moments to see who on the line here is facing a feedback challenge and what those might be. Sustaining feedback over time, and then reporting back to communities. Once or twice seems feasible, but how do we maintain that over a long period? That's a great question. Trust as a result of geographic, gender, language, and cultural differences. Incredible challenge. How do we create a feedback process across so many different contexts that enable us to still have trust, for our constituents to trust us, to trust the process? Colleagues taking feedback as a personal attack rather than towards a project or program. At the beginning, it would be making the right questions, decision on what the right methodology is. Absolutely. Being able to express myself, that overthinking why I need to give feedback. Great. So what I'm seeing here, lack of trust from communities towards NGOs. Yes, I'm seeing a lot of themes emerge here. First, we've got the trust piece and really thinking about how do we ensure our communities, our constituents are trusting us, the NGOs, the people asking for their feedback. And I'm also seeing some elements about what it looks like in our own lives to be giving feedback. Where maybe have we not trusted giving feedback, and how is that affecting how we think about asking for feedback? I see a challenge on developing material that people will actually use and not be forgotten and lost to the internet. How do we get that feedback and ensure that that's something that we can learn from and continue to work on, that it will last? Garnering interest in showcasing why it is important, especially in large organizations. That's huge. Maybe you all on the call today are really bought into it, but what does it look like to get the rest of your organization bought in? Not being sure how the feedback loop will be closed. What will it look like if you close the loop within your community, but it doesn't get taken up the chain? Validating the data that's collected. Yes, these are all incredible challenges. And I say incredible because they are overcomable. These are not challenges we're just gonna leave out in the ether. What we're really gonna dive into today is how can we look at these challenges with a feedback lens and really start to identify what the next steps are into overcoming. So that poll again will continue to be open for a few more minutes throughout the rest of today. You can continue to add your thoughts in there, but I'm gonna launch us right on into some of the methodology. I saw that question, defining what is the right methodology to use that you can use to start applying a feedback lens to some of these challenges, to getting buy-in from the right stakeholders. And then we're going to go back to those workbooks that you have and start to answer some questions in breakout rooms, really applying to those feedback challenges. So here's that loop again. We've talked about where buy-in falls in the feedback loop. So I'm going to take a moment to really dive into what is buy-in specifically. And we said before, it's not a one-time process, that really the key element of buy-in is embedding it into our ongoing culture and practices of feedback at our organization. It pulls back to those comments that we just saw about the challenges that we face and what does it really look like to send this feedback up the organizational change, to make sure that it's not just us who are on the ground, but that we're building trust across our NGO at large. And buy-in can really help ensure that we're orienting with that lens from the beginning of our feedback process. It is also a continued process of really building accountability and constituent input into our inclusive feedback loop. And that helps us increase the sense of ownership for both our network managers, for the decision makers, and for the constituents who are involved in our feedback process. It helps us create an environment that is safe for feedback. It gets to those trust elements that we saw, that people are concerned about, that's part of our challenge. How do we build that trust? And buy-in is a key element to building that trust from the beginning, to really ensure that constituents know they have a right to be giving feedback. There was that question that was asked, right? Like, how do we know if our feedback is something that's actually wanted, that's gonna last? Constituents need to know that they have a right to give feedback, and that feedback isn't just going to disappear, go into the ether, that they can freely give feedback without negative effects. As we build that trust, we want to make sure from the beginning that our constituents are a part of that process. And it's also important to be getting buy-in from our staff, from folks who we saw who are on the ground to the headquarters, that everyone who's going to be affected by this feedback, who may be threatened by the idea of starting to ask for feedback, will also know it won't negatively affect them. And so we want to take a quick look at who all of our common stakeholder groups are within a feedback process. And these are the stakeholder groups. Again, they're listed in your workbook materials that I'm going to ask you to reflect on in just a moment about who some of the top groups of stakeholders that affect your work, but specifically that affect your feedback challenge are. And then we're going to dig into just really focusing on one for the rest of our short time together today. So looking at this list of common stakeholder groups, we see clients. First and foremost, our clients, our constituents, the people who are receiving the services or who are most directly impacted from our program, from our work, and therefore have that set of perceptions on the social issues that we're working with, on what we're trying to do, and who can provide the most relevant feedback on our work. And then we have our community, people who may not directly receive our service, may not directly engage in our program, but are still deeply impacted by this work, who are immediately surrounding our clients. We have our frontline staff, we have the people on the call who said they're on the ground, who are implementing these programs directly, who are in touch with our clients in our community on a daily basis, who may be the ones assisting with that data collection. Then we've got our decision makers. We've got the people who are a little bit more removed from that front line, from the clients, from the community, but whose opinions and buy-in really are affecting what we can do and how we implement our feedback practice. And then of course, we also have our external actors, people who are affected by our work, but may not be in it on a daily basis, may not know exactly how what we are doing, how our feedback that we're collecting is impacting their work and their lives. So I'm going to ask now that you turn back to your workbook. We're going to be on page 6 here, and I think page 5 is where you can get all of that client or all of the stakeholder information again. On page 6 in your workbook, you've got some space for, again, a little bit of reflection to really start to identify of that list of stakeholders, who are the 3 to 4 that you think, generally speaking, need to be involved, that you need buy-in from to solve your feedback challenge. And then your next question is to pick just one. We have a very short time together today. We can't solve all of these challenges. But we can think about one stakeholder. Who is the primary stakeholder that you want to focus on overcoming this challenge with today? And we're going to start to think about what are some ways that we could get them to buy into the process. So I'm going to go ahead and give you another minute or two to start to reflect in your workbooks on these questions. And then we're going to send you into breakout rooms where you'll have the chance to talk with each other in a little bit more detail about this. In your breakout rooms, I invite you to introduce yourselves, to share briefly what your challenge is and who your stakeholders are that you're hoping to engage in this process. So go ahead and take another minute to reflect, and then we'll send you into breakout rooms. So go ahead and take another 30 seconds or so. Who is that key stakeholder? And what are some tactics that you may use with them to secure buy-in? All right, Sherry, are we good to go to send people into breakout rooms?
Yes, we are good to go,
Awesome.
Meg.
All right, I will let the Zoomverse take you away, 6 minutes in your breakout rooms, and we'll see you all back here in the main session to report out on your thoughts. Hi, folks. So I think this is our breakout room in the main room here. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing screen on our side. And I'm gonna mute myself and take myself off video so you all can chat with each other. But if there's anything you need, feel free to holler.
Okay. Hi, is everyone there with me? Anyone there? I'm sorry. Besides Meg?
Hi, Renata, I'm here.
Hi, Cherry, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm good. Okay, so my priority stakeholder are elected officials in Congress and in the municipal government. And let me see here. I actually forgot what's the main question in the slide there, but what I was writing here in the learning material is that I want them to feel that my NGO is a group that is trying to help them with the, when we talk about youth employability. Okay, so Meg just put it here. How do you want them to feel about the feedback challenge? What are some ways you can get them into the buy-in? Yeah, so I want them to feel that we are an organization that are actually helping them to get youth employed in their territories. What are some ways you can get them to buy in the process? This is actually what my group is doing right now. We are, since the beginning of the material collection, we are trying to get them into like a co-creation process. That's it. Someone else wants to share. Don't be shy.
I think the buy-in challenge is always really hard, Renata. Some of the work we do really takes into account different community challenges and bringing people together by gathering their own feedback and data to find out what are key challenges they're facing. And sometimes this could be, for example, around service delivery in the community, and then using that data to sort of feed into policy changes, right? And so for that, you need buy-in in terms of like a whole variety of groups. More often than not, one of the things we strive for is to get especially like marginalized groups like women, youth, people with disabilities to hear their feedback in particular. So those are relationships you have to foster before people trust you to just answer your questions and hand over their data. And then there's the getting the buy-in from other stakeholders. So especially if you're working in a small, more rural community, we often do things like community entrances or mapping to ensure that we can get buy-in from community leaders and elders and other people who will sort of encourage people to get engaged in our work and to trust the organization in a way. So I think it all comes down to like listening and getting buy-in and listening to like what's at the heart of the matter before you even get to the phase where you're like actively collecting feedback, but making sure that you're listening to all the stakeholders that matter and can influence the process.
Yes, I agree with you, Cherry. Anyone else there in our group want to share your experience?
Just as a reminder for a couple of people who joined late, we are thinking about one stakeholder group and how do you want them to feel about a feedback challenge you've identified? What are some of the ways you can get them to buy into the process?
I'm gonna keep talking about my experience then.
Go for it, Renata.
So I feel that we here in Brazil, we have a lot of organizations that already talked to youth in all of their intersectionalities. And now my organization is trying to get to buy in from the Congress people. So we want the congressmen, congresswomen, and the mayors in the municipal governments to adopt a youth employability in their territories. And so we are developing a material and we want them to use it. So we are starting to talk to them since the beginning, but we don't want them, we really want to hear their challenges in public policy, how to implement, and even their challenges to talk to the youth in their territories. I think that's it for now.
That's a great challenge and question as you think about not only getting buy-in from those decision makers, right, from the government level officials, but also getting buy-in from the youth themselves to be a part of the process and to feel like, wait, this is worth my time. My voice will be heard, which is really hard to do if there's no evidence in the past of providing feedback and having it acted on. And so a real interesting challenge that I'm seeing here, while the stakeholder group you might be really focused on wanting to get buy-in from is at the government official level. In order to be able to get their buy-in, we're also talking about getting buy-in from the youth into the process itself. So I think that's a really interesting challenge, Renata, and I'm really excited to follow along as that develops.
Great.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes to dive into those challenges and the stakeholders. I'm going to go ahead and share screen again. And once again, at that Poll Everywhere link at pollev.com/FBL524, we're going to get to see another opportunity to hear out from everyone as to who those stakeholders are that you talked about in your groups that really are impacting your challenge. And go ahead and just type those individuals, the types of groups, the type of stakeholders that you talked about into the Poll Everywhere so we can see where this group as a whole is starting to think about getting buy-in. And feel free also to drop into the chat any other ideas that came up in your conversations about how you might start getting that buy-in. We're about to dig into some best practices and tactics for doing it together, but I'd love to see if anything came up in these first conversations. So I'm seeing we've got decision makers, businesses, government officials, we've got governments overall, elected officials, donors, youth themselves, mayors. We've got a really interesting mix of people here at all different levels of engagement. And one of the things that Renata and I were just talking about, I got to listen in a little bit on one of the groups, that as we start to isolate these stakeholders that we're wanting to engage, it's so clear every time we start to isolate one, and as we talk about what will it take to get their buy-in, how important it is to have buy-in from our other stakeholders that are engaged in the feedback process in order to get buy-in from that group. And so as we start to think about what arguments will convince each of these stakeholders and what we need to do to make that happen, we can also start thinking about who were those other stakeholders and how will getting buy-in from each of them start to overlap and start to engage with each other. I'm loving seeing this word cloud, beneficiaries, communities. We're talking at every level of those constituent groups, of our stakeholders that we want to be getting buy-in. So thank you so much for digging into that with us. Again, this will be open for a few more minutes, so I welcome you all to continue to add in who the stakeholders are. We're going to capture this and share it all out at the end, but I want to be conscious of time and to get into what now? We know who the stakeholders are that we want to be engaging. How do we go about doing it? And I know there were some ideas already starting to surface in the breakout rooms, and I'm going to equip you with 3 key arguments that we talk about when we talk about getting buy-in around feedback that you can start to experiment with those stakeholders that you identified. What of these arguments is really going to work for you as we talk about securing that buy-in in order to make a feedback process normal in your organizations, in your work? And the 3 best arguments that we tend to find work around securing buy-in for feedback is that listening and feedback is the right thing to do morally and ethically. It's the smart thing to do in terms of better outcomes, and it is feasible to do at scale. And so what do we mean by each of these? When we talk about the right thing, we're really looking at the concept that has gotten so many of us into our field, into our work in the first place, that we want to be making choices with our constituents about what our programs do to serve their lives, not about them. And really grounding our work in making choices with, not about, is the right argument for feedback and listening. But it also demonstrates respect for and builds power in the people that we are seeking to serve. And finally, it helps us identify, back to that diversity, equity, inclusion argument from the beginning, it helps us identify whose needs aren't being met and who is often left unheard. And when we think about these arguments, we can start to pull out what, if we believe our stakeholder that we're trying to convince really aligns with this right argument, what can we provide to them to understand why feedback is the right thing to do? We can talk about the link between feedback and equity, how it really does have the chance to create more equitable societies by listening and acting on feedback. And we can share our core principles of constituent feedback about what that looks like. And these are all resources that we'll share with you after and are in your learning materials as well. When we talk about the SMART argument, we're looking at how listening and acting on that feedback has the ability to really transform what our outcomes are, to achieve better results. And I've just put 2 brief examples on the screen here about where we've seen using feedback to increase our outcomes, to improve our results, really has made a difference. We talk about student test scores. We talk about medical costs and patient preferences. We've got another great example online. I should have put on the slide, hearing what's surfacing from all of you about elections and where feedback really impacts just and fair elections. And so if this is an argument that we think is going to resonate with our stakeholders, we can talk about sharing some of these examples to them. We've got a SMART paper, I'll share it with all of you, that really talks about all of these arguments for feedback as the smart thing to do. And then finally, it's feasible to do at scale. We look back at that argument where people are saying, you know, I just resources, time, money, it's all really tight right now. I can't add a new program to the work that I do. And not only is asking for feedback up front in our programs going to save valuable time and money in the long run, but there's also a lot of accessible tools out there to really help make it possible without needing to take a lot of resources, money or staff time up front in order to do that. And again, we'll share out some of these tools that other organizations are using. We'll share out some examples about how you can incorporate this into your work to really streamline that process. And so again, I'm conscious of time. They didn't lie to me. This goes by really quickly. So I'm going to jump right into discussion here, where I'm going to let you think again, quickly reflect in your own workbooks about these three arguments and which of them is resonating with you. But most importantly, which is going to resonate with your priority stakeholder? The number one stakeholder that we identified we need bought into our process in order to begin implementing feedback in our organizations or to improve our feedback process. What do you think will convince those decision makers we saw, the government officials, the community, the youth, all of those stakeholders that we just saw come up on our word map? What argument is going to work for your stakeholder? And then to take a moment and think about, what could you imagine actually saying to your stakeholder around this argument? What would you say to convince them? What information might you still need to access in order to make that argument, in order to share with them? So I'm going to go ahead and give you another minute of reflection here. We're going to send you back into those same breakout rooms to be able to have a little bit more of a conversation with each other around those arguments and how it impacts your stakeholders and that feedback challenge that you've already started discussing. And then we'll bring you back to the main room, share out one final time, and then I think we're going to be at time at the end of your very busy day. So go ahead and take another 30 seconds to a minute to reflect on these arguments in your own workbooks, and then we'll send you into those breakout rooms in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and drop these questions in the chat as well. I think the chat should fly with you into your breakout room, so you'll have access to those for discussion. Great, so you're going to have about 4 minutes in your breakout rooms to talk about how you're going to use these arguments to support your key stakeholder in convincing them that feedback is worth it in your organization and in your work. So Sherry, I'll let you send us into the Zoomverse whenever we're ready.
Here we go.
Hello again.
Hello, Meg. Okay, so I believe the best argument for the government officials would be the better outcomes argument, and also the scale argument, because when we get to them and say, we can make your government more successful because we have the bridge between you and youth, and we we can bring better outcomes for your government. So I believe this would be the best. And it's actually the argument that we are using now, trying to tell them how we can help them and bring this knowledge that they might not have.
I think that's great. And I'd be curious to hear how using that argument so far has been going. Kind of what have you been using in terms of building that case that there are going to be better outcomes? And maybe, you know, what else could you imagine needing? So I can think of a few examples where we have other evidence of feedback working for convincing government officials. And I'd love to send those your way about being able to pull in case studies and examples of other conversations with government officials that have worked or other outcomes that have changed because of engaging feedback, and how using those examples of feedback being the smart thing to do could support your government officials being like, oh, well, it won't just be us. I guess if that government's done it, or if those officials think it's worth it, maybe it's worth giving a go.
Yes, I think the first thing we are doing is to show data and facts on how this kind of action is working in other cities and even in other countries. Because here in Brazil, it's election time, so it's very sensitive, as in the US, it can get political, and this is not very good right now. So we are trying to get international examples to show them, oh, look, in Europe, this is actually helping them. We can help you bring in examples and about youth employability policies. But yeah, it would be great to see another examples and initiatives that you have been working with, Meg.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to share your way. Sherry, any thoughts on your side?
Yeah, I mean, I also think that when people understand the outcomes and that it essentially like makes their work better, and sometimes you have to play into like people's into their own motives for why they do the work that they do, right? Especially I think when you're working with elected officials, for example, like having them understand how it makes them look better in front of their constituents. It might sound cynical in a way to look at it from that angle, but often you have to leverage like people's personal motivation, which I think could be useful in our work with sort of like at the local community level. A lot of it is also around like, here is how we can co-create solutions so like that we all have better outcomes at the end. I think there's also an argument to be made for including people's feedback creates a more equitable system. And that in a way, especially if you can showcase how it's very possible to hear from marginalized groups and to actually incorporate that, and that like there's willingness, if you can create willingness to do that, you can make a strong argument around equity. Now, it isn't always easy to find people to buy into that, but I think it's an angle worth always pursuing and keeping front of mind.
I think that's a great point, Sherry, and also keeping in mind that the arguments that do work best for us are not necessarily the arguments that are going to work best for each of these stakeholders. Because, right, I think about, as I said, like what kind of got so many of us all in this sort of thing is that right argument. This is what we believe is the right thing to do, but that might not be the right argument for everyone. And so I think that's a really great point, Sherry, to be thinking about how do each of these arguments and other arguments, as you brought up the equity piece, really feed into that larger conversation. So I know we are just at time here. Welcome back, everyone. I'm really curious just to hear one final report out as to kind of which arguments do we think are going to be working for our organizations, for our stakeholders, seeing what that looks like from this group. And as you all are reporting all of those out, just a final key few pieces here about what's next. In your learning materials, there's a ton of resources, both that have the context and the information that I shared verbally with you all today. You can go back and check out that written information, those resources. And then the final page also shares ways that you can be involved with feedback labs, with the wider feedback community as you continue to dig into these feedback challenges. Join our newsletter, hear some of the stories of other organizations that are doing this. Get some of those case studies. Renata and I were talking about what it looks like to really start integrating these arguments and examples of what other people are doing into your work. So that's all in your learning material. Thank you all so much for being a part of here. It looks like a 50-50 split between smart and feasible. Oh, it's changing, But it's really great to see that there are arguments that are going to work for you and your stakeholders. I hope that you all take this forward into your work. Please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter, on the website. I'm also just meg@feedbacklabs.org if you want to reach out to me directly. It was so wonderful being in this workshop with all of you today. Thank you. Keep closing those feedback loops and enjoy the rest of your summit all day tomorrow. Have a good one.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. Just a reminder to check back on your registration emails to participate in our map, in all of the different ancillary things, take part in our social media challenge. If you give me 1 second, I'll just pull these up for you one last time so that you can have a quick look. And we hope to see you all back with us tomorrow.